14 years. That is how long a human heart can hold its breath before the ribs begin to ache from the vacuum. They say that in the high-altitude penthouses of Seoul, the air is thinner, purer, but they lie. The air here tastes of ozone, expensive filtered oxygen, and the metallic tang of the blood that was spilled to build these towers of glass and greed. My father, a man who saw his daughters not as flesh and blood, but as versatile currency, had finally spent his greatest coin. I was the bridge, a geopolitical marriage designed to fuse the ancient, sun-drenched power of a West African dynasty with the sharp, cutting-edge lethality of a South Korean syndicate. I was meant to be the link that unified two worlds. Instead, on my wedding night, I felt like a sacrificial lamb walking barefoot into a cathedral made of jagged, unfeeling ice. The penthouse was a masterpiece of cold, predatory architecture. It was a temple of obsidian, brushed steel, and white marble that looked more like a gallery for a dead civilization than a home for a living woman. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of a metropolis that never truly sleeps, a neon grid of electric blues and bruised violets that mirrored the storm surging inside my own chest. Outside, the monsoon rain lashed against the glass with a rhythmic, violent weeping, a sound that seemed to mock the absolute, suffocating silence of the room. I sat on the edge of the oversized, king-sized bed, the cream silk of my nightgown feeling less like a garment and more like a shroud. I am a woman who has been through the fires of marriage 3 times before, always a pawn, always a transaction in someone else's ledger, always a body traded for a border or a shipping lane. But this time was supposed to be different. This time, I had allowed myself the dangerous luxury of hope. I had looked at the dossiers. I had seen the photos of the man they called the King of Seoul, and I had foolishly expected a spark. When Min-jun entered the room, the temperature didn't just drop. It froze in the air. He didn't look like a groom coming to claim his bride. He looked like a weary executioner returning from a long day at the gallows, his soul heavy with the ghosts of the men he'd had to step over to reach this door. His dark, shoulder-length hair fell over his brow, shadowing eyes that held a darkness I couldn't begin to decipher. I reached for him, my hand trembling, my fingers seeking just a sliver of warmth to prove that this wasn't just another business merger, another cold exchange of assets. I reached out, expecting a friction, a sign that beneath the tattoos and the bespoke suits, there was a man who hungered for the woman I had become. Instead, I found a glacier. As my fingers neared his arm, he pulled away with a sharp, clinical coldness that cut deeper than any blade I'd ever faced in the back alleys of Lagos. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a total, systematic erasure of my existence.
He didn't even look at me.
He looked through me, staring at the rain, staring at the neon, staring perhaps at the legacy of violence he was forced to uphold. "Do not mistake a contract for a connection," he said, his voice a low, jagged blade that sliced through the remaining hope in my heart. "You are here to ensure a legacy, not to share a life." The silence that followed was louder than the thunder shaking the skyscraper. I was his wife by the laws of men and the signatures of kings, but I was a ghost by his decree. In that moment, I realized my 4th marriage wasn't a union. It was an incarceration. Echoing, sharp footsteps on polished marble. Faint, cruel whispers in the distance that cut off abruptly whenever she turns a corner. Power has a very specific flavor, and in this penthouse, it tasted of copper, expensive sandalwood, and absolute, crushing isolation. I had traded the vibrant, sun-drenched heat of Nigeria, a land that breathes fire, rhythm, and the chaotic pulse of a city that never stops moving, for the sterile, soundproof luxury of a Korean fortress. In my emerald green blazer and tailored trousers, I looked like a queen prepared for a global summit. My posture was a fortress. My clothes were a suit of armor. I looked like I owned the world, but inside the silk lining of that expensive suit, I was hollow. I was a phantom wandering through the halls of a museum I wasn't allowed to touch. I spent my days walking the cavernous hallways, my heels clicking against the marble like a countdown to a climax that never arrived. The penthouse was a masterpiece of global luxe, Parisian antiques, Korean minimalist art, and African artifacts that felt like they were screaming for the sun just as loudly as I was. Every statue, every painting felt like a reminder of how far I was from the earth. The staff moved through the shadows like well-dressed wraiths, their faces masks of professional indifference. They spoke in hushed, rhythmic Korean, thinking I didn't understand the bitter weight of their cadences. The foreign bride, the expensive toy, the queen of a kingdom that won't let her in. They smirked when I passed, their eyes tracing the invisible scars on my soul that no emerald fabric or French tailoring could ever hope to hide. They saw me as an intruder, a dark-skinned jewel intended to be displayed at syndicate galas to show the world that the king of Seoul had reached across the globe and taken whatever he desired. But a trophy isn't loved. It is maintained. It is polished. It is kept behind thick, bulletproof glass. I would stand by the window for hours, watching the rain turn the city into a blurred, neon watercolor. I miss the smell of the dust after a rain in Lagos. I miss the sound of people who weren't afraid to speak. Every night, I would return to my separate quarters, listening to the hum of the air conditioning, feeling the weight of the diamonds around my neck like a gilded collar. I had been sold to the most powerful man in the country, and in doing so, I had become the most invisible woman in the world. I was discarded in plain sight, a royal prisoner in a penthouse paradise, waiting for the ice to finally reach my heart and turn me into the statue everyone already believed I was. My gosh, guys, did you hear that? Do not mistake a contract for a connection. I am literally screaming at my screen right now. If you're feeling the rage for her already, or if you think Min-jun is hiding something behind that icy exterior, let me know in the comments right now. Don't forget to subscribe and like the content if you're ready to see our queen take her power back. Let's move into the shattering of Sanity in Act 2. Sanity is not a solid foundation. It is a fragile glass floor, and for months, I had been watching the cracks spiderweb beneath my feet. To live as a ghost in a museum of modern luxury is to slowly lose the ability to believe you are real. I had played the part of the dutiful, silent consort, the beautiful Nigerian enigma draped in emerald and gold, until the very air in the penthouse began to feel like it was composed of lead. If I was to be treated as a transaction, I would be a closed one. If I was to be viewed as a contract, I would be a voided one. I was a woman who had already survived 3 marriages. I knew the smell of a dying fire, and I refused to freeze to death in the embers of this one. I walked into the grand dining room, the atmosphere thick with the scent of aged bourbon and the lingering, ozone-heavy charge of a gathering storm. Min-jun sat at the head of a mahogany table that stretched between us like a dark, polished ocean, a desert of wood where no life could grow. The light from the modern crystal chandelier overhead didn't illuminate the room. It shattered, casting sharp, diamond-like shards of light across his face, highlighting the lethal symmetry of his features and the cold stillness of his dark eyes. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I placed the legal separation papers on the table, a final white flag of surrender, a document that simply asked for the one thing he had given me since our wedding night anyway: my absence. I expected the glacier to remain. I expected him to sign those papers with the same clinical, bored indifference he used to order a syndicate hit or a multi-billion-dollar merger in the shipping lanes. I expected him to be relieved that the foreign jewel was finally removing herself from his display case. But as his eyes fell upon the bold, unforgiving letters of the document, the just ruler of the Seoul underworld, the man of logic and steel, simply evaporated into a mist of pure, unadulterated rage. The sound of his hand hitting the mahogany table was like a gunshot in a vacuum. He didn't sign them. He grabbed the papers, his knuckles turning a ghostly, bloodless white, the intricate, dark tattoos on his neck and hands pulsing with a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. And then he began to shred. He didn't just tear the papers. He destroyed them with a feral, rhythmic desperation. He ripped through the heavy vellum as if he were trying to tear the very concept of my departure out of the physical world. The white fragments began to flutter into the air, falling like a sudden, localized snowstorm over the wreckage of our life together, landing in his hair, on his suit, and on the polished wood like ashes from a burnt bridge. You think you can just leave? He roared, a sound that didn't come from a king, but from a wounded beast that had finally realized its most prized possession was slipping through its claws. His voice vibrated in the very marrow of my bones, a raw, terrifying frequency I had never heard in the months of his icy silence. For the first time in this marriage, he was looking at me, really looking at me. His eyes weren't ice anymore. They were a forest fire at midnight. I stood my ground, my purple-tinted eyes wide with a shock that was rapidly morphing into a twisted, electric thrill. If he didn't want me, why was he destroying the one thing that gave him peace? The paradox of his fury was the first sign of life I had seen in him, and it was the most terrifyingly beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. He wasn't ignoring me anymore. He was haunting me. If I could not be a wife, I would be a phantom of the night. If I could not find a home in his heart, I would lose myself in the neon-drenched veins of the city he claimed to rule. I left the penthouse that night as the white paper scraps still settled on the floor like dead leaves. I traded my emerald blazer for a gown of deep red silk, the color of a warning, the color of the blood he spent his days spilling, the color of a heart that had finally decided to beat for itself. I hid my identity behind a delicate, ornate masquerade mask, stepping into the pulsing, illicit heat of an underground VIP club where names were irrelevant and only the intensity of the moment had currency. The air inside was a thick, intoxicating soup of expensive perfume, high-end gin, and the electric scent of impending sin. I stood on the edge of the dance floor, a breathtaking vision of Afro-Luxe elegance in a sea of masked, nameless shadows. For the first time in years, the suffocating silence of the penthouse was replaced by a bass so deep it felt like a borrowed heartbeat, a rhythm I could finally dance to. I wanted to be touched by someone who didn't see a contract. I wanted to be seen by someone who didn't see a trophy. And then, a hand touched mine. It wasn't a cold, clinical touch. It didn't feel like the rejection I had lived with for 14 years. It was a man in a sharp, dark suit, his face a mystery behind a black silk mask, his touch firm and filled with a quiet, masculine question. He didn't know I was the queen of the Seoul syndicate. He didn't know I was a woman sold into a gilded cage by a father who loved gold more than his own daughter. To him, I was just a breathtaking stranger in red silk, a goddess who had descended into the neon underworld. As he began to lead me away from the crowded dance floor toward the dark, velvet-draped VIP doorways, I didn't resist. I leaned into the mystery. I wanted to forget the mahogany table. I wanted to forget the shredded papers. I wanted to disappear into the crimson and purple neon glow, to overwrite the memory of a husband who only seemed to notice I existed when I finally tried to vanish forever. My gosh, guys, did you see that?
And now,
Our queen is at an underground club with a total stranger, wearing red silk and looking for a way to forget it all. If your team, let her have her fun, or team, he better go get her before he loses her. Let me know in the comments right now. This is getting so intense. Don't forget to subscribe and like the content if you're ready for the absolute explosion that's coming in Act 3. A sudden, violent boom that vibrates through the speakers, followed by the sharp, splintering sound of heavy oak wood giving way. A high-pitched, ringing silence follows before the heavy bass of the club in the distance resonates. The air in the VIP chamber was thick, a heavy, suffocating soup of expensive perfume, spilled vintage cognac, and the electric scent of impending sin. I sat on the edge of the plush, velvet bed, the weight of the stranger's hand lingering on my shoulder like a question I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. I had come here to drown the memory of the mahogany table, to find a touch that didn't feel like a business transaction or a cold dismissal. I wanted to feel real, even if only for a night in the shadows of the underground. But the moment was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a den of illicit pleasure. The reinforced oak door didn't just open, it disintegrated. The splinters flew across the room like jagged shrapnel, embedded in the velvet curtains and the thick carpet. Standing in the doorway, framed by the pulsing purple haze of the corridor, was Min-jun. He looked like a god of ruin. His broad shoulders filled the entire frame, his dark, shoulder-length hair disheveled and falling into eyes that burned with a terrifying, homicidal light. He didn't look like the refined, clinical kingpin of the Seoul syndicate anymore. He looked like a predator that had finally tracked its mate into the heart of a rival's territory.
He didn't speak.
He didn't need to. The sheer force of the homicidal heat radiating from him made my blood sing a high, dangerous note of pure adrenaline. The stranger beside me, a man who had seemed so bold only moments ago, withered into the shadows, his bravado evaporating like mist in a forest fire. Min-jun's focus was absolute, a laser point of possessive fury that pinned me to the bed more effectively than any physical restraint. He wasn't here to save my honor. He was here to reclaim his territory. The just ruler was dead, and in his place stood a man who would burn the entire city to the ground before he let another hand touch what was his. The steady, heavy thrum of rain hitting an umbrella. The deep, guttural idle of a high-performance SUV engine waiting in the dark. The sound of heavy footsteps splashing through puddles. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace, dismissing the stranger with a single, chilling look that sent the man scrambling for the exit without a backward glance. Min-jun didn't say a word to me. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand an apology. He simply scooped me up in one fluid, powerful motion, his arms like bands of heated iron around my waist and knees. I felt the strength of him, a power that could crush or protect, and for the first time in 14 years, I didn't fight it. My vibrant red silk gown trailed in the rain as he carried me out of the club, a streak of vivid blood against the dark, grimy asphalt of the back alleys. We moved through the rainy streets of Seoul, the neon signs of the criminal district flashing overhead like warnings. He walked through the crowd of stunned killers, debt collectors, and informants as if they were nothing more than dust beneath his boots. He reached the heavy, black armored SUV, the engine growling in anticipation. In his arms, the world felt terrifyingly small, reduced to the scent of his cologne and the rain on his skin. As he placed me inside the darkened cabin, the door closing with a heavy, final thud, I realized the cage hadn't been the penthouse, and the bars weren't made of marble and glass. The cage was the space between his heart and mine, a distance he was currently closing with the speed of a bullet. Heavy, labored breathing, the rustle of expensive silk sheets and the low, dangerous hum of the city through the glass. The sound of a heart beating rapidly. Back in the master suite, the cold museum of our marriage had transformed. The air didn't feel thin or sterile anymore. It turned to gasoline, waiting for the first spark to turn the entire floor into an inferno. He didn't wait for the door to click shut before he was on me. He pinned me to the center of the plush, king-sized bed, his weight a heavy, welcome pressure that grounded me. His tattooed hands were a permanent brand on my skin as he pinned my wrists to the mattress. His dark human eyes, usually so stoic and distant, were mere inches from mine, searching my face with a feral, raw intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Who touched you?" he growled, his voice a low, jagged vibration that felt like a caress and a threat all at once. The jealousy was honest. It was ugly. It was real. For 14 years, I had begged for a sign that I was more than a contract to him. I had begged for a spark. Now, I was standing in the center of a conflagration. He wasn't a just ruler anymore. He was a man who had realized his silence had almost cost him the only thing that made the violence of his life worth enduring. Every touch now was a signature, a violent and passionate overwriting of the years of neglect. He claimed my skin, my breath, and my very soul with a heat that threatened to consume us both until there was nothing left of the contract, only the two of us, finally burning together in the dark. My gosh, guys, did you see the way he looked at her? And that scene in the bedroom? Who touched you? I am screaming. That is the first honest thing he has said to her in 14 years. I hope you're all in your seats and as excited as I am for the next part, because when a man like Min-jun finally breaks his silence, the entire empire is going to feel the aftershocks. Don't forget to subscribe and like the content if you're ready for Act 4. We're moving from the heat of the moment into the heart of the man, and trust me, you are not ready for what happens when the mafia boss finally breaks. the sound of soft, ragged, and hollow sobbing. A minimalist, lonely piano melody begins, each note dripping like a tear on a cold marble floor. The distant, muffled hum of the city remains, but it feels a world away. They say that when a star dies, it collapses under the weight of its own gravity until it becomes a void so dense that not even light can escape it. For 14 years, I had watched Min-jun exist as that void, a man of absolute, crushing density who pulled everything into his orbit but gave nothing back. He was the king of Seoul, the architect of a criminal empire that spanned continents, a man whose very name was whispered as a synonym for iron-fisted control. But in the quiet aftermath of the storm, in the blue-gray shadows of our master suite, the star finally went dark. The monster didn't just fade, he broke. I watched breathless as the terrifying king of the syndicate, the man who had just violently reclaimed me from the neon underworld, completely disintegrated. He didn't just sit. He collapsed onto his knees on the cold, polished marble floor beside the bed. His broad, tattooed shoulders, usually a fortress of strength, began to shake with a silent, agonizing grief that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. These weren't the tears of a man who had lost a battle. These were the tears of a man who had finally realized he had been losing his soul for over a decade. 14 years of suppressed agony, 14 years of playing a role he hated, and 14 years of being so terrified that his violent, blood-soaked world would destroy the vibrant light I brought into it, that he chose to freeze me out instead of letting me burn. It all came pouring out in ragged, heavy sobs. As I knelt gracefully on the marble floor beside him, my long, elegant fingers cupped his tear-streaked face. For the first time, I didn't see the boss. I didn't see the just ruler. I saw the boy who had loved me from a distance, a boy who thought that if he never touched me, he could never break me. I wiped away the salt and the sorrow, realizing that my fourth marriage hadn't been a cage. It had been a sanctuary he didn't know how to enter. A rising, cinematic orchestral swell. The sound of deep, synchronized breathing and the warm, golden hum of a city at peace. The music is triumphant, yet deeply intimate. There were no more secrets, no more masks, no more cold contracts or silent dinners in rooms that felt like mausoleums. The ice had not only melted, it had evaporated into a heat that made the very air around us shimmer. We collided with the force of two separate empires finally uniting, not for the sake of shipping lanes or gold reserves, but for the sake of two souls that had finally found their way home through the dark. In the warm, golden glow of the Seoul skyline, we began to rewrite our history. Every kiss was a solemn vow to never return to the silence. Every touch was a conquest of the fears that had kept us as strangers under the same roof for a decade and a half. His dark silk shirt was parted, revealing the intricate map of his history written in ink upon his chest, a map I was finally allowed to read. He lifted my frame, my natural hair cascading over his shoulders like a dark silk curtain, and in that moment, the hierarchy of the syndicate ceased to exist. We weren't just a South Korean kingpin and his Nigerian consort anymore. We were a revolution. We were a new kind of power, an Afro-Korean dynasty built not on the cold exchange of assets, but on a foundation of fire and mutual surrender. We had overwritten the past, and as the sun began to rise over the metropolis, the light didn't just hit the glass of the penthouse, it finally found its way inside. Gentle, light ambient music, like sunlight filtering through a high window. The soft, melodic chime of wind bells in the distance. Power is a hollow, dangerous thing if it isn't used to shield those who cannot protect themselves. As we moved from the shadows of our passion into the light of our shared rule, I realized that my role had shifted. I was no longer the jewel in the cabinet. I was the hand that held the scepter. I began to see the penthouse not as a gilded cage, but as a fortress for those who had been overlooked by the men who played at godhood. I remember the morning I saw my own reflection in the eyes of a young, trembling syndicate maid. She was pregnant, her hands shaking as she tried to polish a marble surface that was already perfect. She was terrified of the world we inhabited, a girl caught in the gears of an empire that usually ground the innocent into dust. I didn't offer her a stern word or a cold dismissal. I reached out and pressed a fortune in blinding, sparkling jewels into her trembling palms. It was a ticket out, a dowry for a life we were only just beginning to build for ourselves. A queen doesn't just rule her people, she protects them. A legend doesn't just hoard the future, she grants it. As I watched her leave with tears of gratitude, I felt a wistful longing for a peace I knew we might never fully possess in this life of shadows, but it was a peace I would now kill to defend. We were building an empire, yes, but this time, we were building it with a heart. My gosh, did you guys see that?
I am literally in tears right now.
And that kiss? The consummation of the empire? I am screaming. They aren't just a contract anymore. They are a revolution. I hope you're all in your seats and as excited as I am for the finale, because when things get this good in a mafia story, you know the final stand is right around the corner. We're heading into the war, and trust me, our queen is ready to show the world exactly why you never, ever bet against her. A sharp, cold wind howling through an open balcony door. The sound of a heavy objects being overturned. A long, suffocating silence follows. They say that the past is a ghost that refuses to stay buried, but in my world, the past is a debt collector that always finds your new address. I had spent 14 years in a cold marriage, only to finally find the fire, but my father, the man who had sold me like a piece of livestock to the highest bidder, wasn't finished with his ledgers. The betrayal didn't come with a gunshot or a blade in the dark. It arrived in a dark purple envelope, bearing a heavy wax seal that smelled of old parchment and the dust of my homeland. I sat in the wreckage of my study, the side table overturned in a moment of rare, unbridled grief. My world, so recently illuminated by Min-jun's love, had suddenly turned a flat, unforgiving gray. The letter was a cold decree. My father had liquidated my remaining interests in Lagos, selling my heritage and my standing to our bitterest rivals to settle his own gambling debts. He had effectively erased my history, stripping me of the only identity I had left outside of this penthouse. I felt crumpled on the cold marble floor, staring blankly at the overturned glass and the scattered items of a life that felt like it was disappearing. Everything I was had been sold for a seat at a table that had never truly wanted me. I was a queen without a kingdom, a daughter without a father, and for a moment, the crushing emptiness of the room felt like it was going to swallow me whole. I was back where I started, a ghost in a museum, waiting for the world to decide my value. Bold, rhythmic percussion that sounds like a war drum. A heavy, distorted bass drop that vibrates the floor. The metallic slide of a firearm being readied. But I was no longer the woman who had walked into this penthouse 14 years ago. And I was certainly no longer the woman who sat waiting for a man to notice her existence. Min-jun appeared in the grand entrance of the master suite. He didn't offer me platitudes or empty comfort.
He didn't tell me it would be all right.
He did something much better. He offered me a weapon. He stood tall, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his hand resting menacingly on his holstered firearm. He reached down and pulled me up from the floor, his grip firm and absolute. He didn't just help me stand. He pulled me into his orbit, standing firmly beside me as an equal. I wiped away the last of my tears, and in their place, a lethal, newfound power began to blaze. My purple-tinted eyes didn't look for mercy anymore. They looked for targets. My father thought he had destroyed me by taking my past, but he had simply removed the last of my inhibitions. He had given me a reason to go to war. Standing to my full, statuesque height, I realized I wasn't a survivor or a pawn anymore. I was the storm. Beside my husband, I was the co-architect of a new kind of empire. We stood side by side at the grand entrance, an unstoppable, fiercely protective mafia power couple ready to claim what was ours by right of blood and fire. Let them come for the throne. Let them try to break the contract. We were no longer bound by paper or by the whims of old men in distant lands. We were bound by a love that had survived the ice and was now ready to burn the world to the ground. Let them come. We are ready for war. And there you have it. The The storm has officially arrived. My gosh, did you see the look in her eyes at the end? She isn't just a survivor anymore. She is the queen of the entire syndicate. Her father thought he could take her heritage, but he only gave her a reason to take his throne. I hope you all enjoyed this AFRO Korean mafia story of power, betrayal, and a love that finally found its fire. If you're riding with our power couple into battle, you need to let me know in the comments right now. Who do you think is going down first? Thank you for watching. Hit that like button on your way out, and remember, in this empire, we don't just stay in the cage. We rule. See you in the next one.